1. Hungry Shadows. Charlie's ugly Crocs stuck to the mats on the floor behind the bar, making a sticky, squelching sound. Sweat slicked the skin under her arms, at the hollow of her throat, and between her thighs. This was her second shift today. The afternoon guy quit abruptly to follow his boyfriend to Los Angeles, and she was stuck with his hours until Odette hired a replacement. But as tired as Charlie was, she needed the cash, and she figured she better keep busy. Keeping busy meant keeping out of trouble. There'd always been something wrong with Charlie Hall. Crooked, from the day she was born. Never met a bad decision she wasn't willing to double down on. Had fingers made for picking pockets, a tongue for lying, and a shriveled cherry pit for a heart. If her shadow had been one of those magic ones, she was pretty sure even that thing would have run away. But that didn't mean she couldn't try to be different. And she was trying. Sure, it had been hard to keep her worst impulses in check these past 10 months, but it was better than being a lit match in a town she'd already doused in gasoline. She had a job, with a timesheet even, and a stolid brick of a boyfriend who paid his share of the rent. Her gunshot wound was healing nicely. Little successes, but that didn't mean she wasn't proud of them. It was on that thought that Charlie looked up to see a test of her resolve walk through the double doors of Rapture Bar and Lounge. Doreen Kowalski's face looked hot and blotchy with crying. She'd obviously tried to fix her makeup, but had wiped her mascara so hard that it winged out to one side. Back in high school, she wouldn't have given Charlie the time of day, and she probably didn't want to tonight either. There are countless differences between the lives of people with money and people without. One is this. Without the means to pay experts, it's necessary to evolve a complex ecosystem of useful amateurs. When Charlie's dad got what the doctor told him was a skin cancer, he drank a fifth of Maker's Mark and asked a butcher friend to cut a divot out of his shoulder, because there was no way he could afford a surgeon. When Charlie's friend's cousin got married, they asked Mrs. Silva from 3 blocks over to make their wedding cake, because she loved to bake and had fancy pastry piping doodads. And if the buttercream was a little grainy or one of the layers was a bit overbaked, well, it was still sweet and just as tall as a cake in a magazine, and it cost only the price of supplies. In the world of shadow magic, Charlie was a successful thief. But to the locals, she would always be a useful amateur, willing to palm a wedding ring or retrieve a dog-napped pit bull. Charlie Hall, drawn to a bad idea like a moth to a wool sweater. Every hustle an opportunity to let her worst impulses out to play. "I need to talk to you," Doreen said loudly, reaching for Charlie as she passed. It had been a slow night at the lounge, but Odette, the ancient, semi-retired dominatrix who owned the place, was sitting at a table out front, gossiping with her cronies. She'd notice if Charlie chatted to one person for too long, and Charlie couldn't afford to lose this gig. Bartending at Rapture was a lucky break, given her track record. It had been arranged by Balthazar, who ran a shadow parlor out of the basement, speakeasy style, and had good reasons to keep an eye on her. Not the least of which was that he wanted her to come back to work for him. And as Charlie looked over at Doreen and that familiar excitement stirred in her, she felt the precariousness of her commitment to the straight and narrow, like a strategy for success that's only the word profit with a lot of exclamation points. "Can I get you a drink?" she asked Doreen. Doreen shook her head. "You have to help me find Adam. He disappeared again, and can't talk now," Charlie interrupted. "Order something to keep my boss off my back. Club soda and bitters, cranberry and lime, whatever. It's on me." Doreen's wet, red-rimmed eyes suggested that she'd have a hard time waiting, or that she'd had a few drinks before she arrived. Maybe both. "Hey!" one of the regulars called, and Charlie turned away to take his order, made a cosmopolitan that spilled ruby red out of the shaker, topped it with a tiny pellet of dry ice that sent smoke wafting up, as though from a potion. She checked on another table, a guy who was nursing a beer, trembling fingers applying a third nicotine patch to his inner arm. He wanted to keep his tab open. Charlie poured a shot of 4 Roses for a tweedy guy in dirty glasses who looked like he'd been sleeping in his clothes and told her he didn't like his bourbon too sweet. Then she crossed to the other end of the bar, pausing to make a whiskey and ginger for Balthazar himself when he waved her over. "Got a job for you," he said under his breath. With his flashing eyes, light brown skin, and curls long enough to be pulled back into a disreputable ponytail, he lorded over his shadow parlor, making the town's corrupt dreams come true. "Nope," Charlie said, moving on. "Come on. Night Singh got murdered in his bed, and the room was trashed. Someone made off with his personal folio of magical discoveries." Balthazar called after her, unconvinced. "This is what you were best at." "Nope," she called back as cheerfully as she could manage. Fuck Night Singh. He had been the first glomist ever to contract Charlie's services, back when she was just a kid. As far as she was concerned, he could rot in his grave. But that still didn't mean she was going to rob it. Charlie was out of the game. She'd been too good at it, and the collateral damage had been too high. Now she was just a regular person. A drunken trio of witchy-looking 20-somethings were celebrating a weeknight birthday, black lipstick smeared over their mouths. They ordered shots of cheap, neon-green absinthe and winced them down. One must have recently gotten her shadow altered, because she kept moving so the light would catch it and project her new self onto the wall. It had horns and wings, like a succubus. It was beautiful. "My mother hates it," the girl was telling her friends, voice slightly slurred. She gave a hop and hovered in the air for a moment as her shadow wings fluttered, and a few patrons glanced over admiringly. "Mom says that when I try to get a real job, I'm going to regret having something I can't hide. I told her it was my commitment to never selling out." The first time Charlie had ever seen an altered shadow, it had made her think of a fairy tale she'd read as a child in the school library. The Witch and the Unlucky Brother. She still recalled the story's opening lines. Once upon a time, a boy was born with a hungry shadow. He was as lucky could be, while all the ill luck was bestowed on his twin, who was born with no shadow at all. But of course, this girl's shadow wasn't lucky. It looked cool and gave her a bit of minor magic. She could maybe get 3 inches off the ground for a couple of seconds at a time. A pair of stacked heels would have taken her higher. It didn't make the girl a glomist either. Manipulated shadows were the specialty of alterationists, the most public-facing of the 4 disciplines. Alterationists could cosmetically shape shadows, use them to trigger emotions so strong they could be addictive, and even cut out pieces of a person's subconscious. There were risks, of course. Sometimes people lost a lot more of themselves than they bargained for. The other gloaming disciplines were more secretive. Carapaces focused on their own shadows, using them to soar through the air on shadow wings or armor themselves. Puppeteers sent their shadows to do things in secret. In Charlie's experience, largely the kind of foul shit no one wanted to talk about. And the masks weren't much better. A bunch of creeps and mystics intent on unraveling the secrets of the universe, no matter who it hurt. There was a reason they got called glooms, instead of their proper title. You couldn't trust them as far as you could throw them. For example, no matter what gloamist said, they all trafficked in stolen shadows. Charlie's boyfriend, Vince, had been robbed of his. Probably so some rich fuck could have his third go-round at an alteration. Now he cast no shadow at all, not even in the brightest of bright light. It was believed that shadowless people had an absence in them, a lack of some intangible thing. Sometimes people passing Vince on the street would notice and give him a wide berth. Charlie wished people would get the hell out of her way, too. But it bothered Vince, so she glared at every single person who did it. When Charlie circled back, Doreen said, "I'll take a ginger ale to settle my stomach." Odette seemed distracted by her friends. "Okay, what's the problem?" "I think Adam's gone on another bender," said Doreen, as Charlie put the drink in front of her, along with a cocktail napkin. "The casino called. If he doesn't come in on Monday, they're going to fire his ass. I keep trying his cell, but he won't answer me." Charlie and Doreen had never been particularly friendly, but they knew some of the same people. And sometimes knowing someone for a long time seemed more important than liking them. Charlie sighed. "So what is it you want me to do?" "Find him and make him come home," Doreen said. "Maybe remind him he's got a kid?" "I don't know that I can make him do anything," Charlie said. "You're the reason Adam's like this," Doreen told her. "He keeps taking on extra jobs that are too dangerous." "How exactly is that my fault?" Charlie wiped down the bar area in front of her for something to do. "Because Balthazar's always comparing him to you. Adam's trying to measure up to your stupid reputation. But not everyone's a born criminal." Doreen's partner, Adam, was a blackjack dealer over at the Springfield Casino and had started working for Balthazar part-time after Charlie quit. Maybe he thought that dealing with whatever sketchy shit went on at the tables prepared him for stealing from glooms. She also suspected that Adam had thought if Charlie could do it, it must not be that hard. "We can talk more after my shift," Charlie said with a sigh, thinking of all the reasons she ought to steer clear. For one, she was the last person Adam would want to see in any context. For another, this was going to result in zero money. Rumor had it that Adam had been spending his extra Balthazar-dispensed cash rolling bliss. That is, getting your shadow tweaked, so you could stare into space for hours as awesome emotions flooded through you. Adam was probably lying on his back in a hotel room, feeling real good, and definitely wouldn't want Charlie dragging him home before that wore off. Charlie looked over at Doreen, the last thing she needed right then, sitting at the other end of the bar, playing miserably with her stirrer. Charlie was just reaching for the seltzer pump when a crash made her look up. The Tweety guy, with the not-too-sweet bourbon request and nervous tics, was now on his hands and knees next to the empty stage, tangled in a swag of velvet curtain. One of the goons from the shadow parlor, a man named Joey Asprins, stood over the guy as though trying to decide whether to kick him in the face. Balthazar had followed them up the stairs, still yelling. "Are you crazy? Trying to get me to fence that? You setting me up to look like I'm the one that stole the Liber Noctum? Get the fuck out of here!" "It's not like that," the Tweety guy said. "Salt's desperate to get even part of it back. He'll pay real money. Charlie flinched at Salt's name. Not a lot rattled her, after everything she'd seen and done, but the thought of him always did. Shut up and get out! Balthazar pointed toward the exit. What's going on? Doreen asked. Charlie shook her head, watching Joey Aspirins shove the Tweety guy toward the doors. Odette got up to talk with Balthazar, their voices too soft for her to overhear. Balthazar turned, catching Charlie's eye as he was walking back to the shadow parlor. He winked. She ought to have raised her eyebrow or rolled her eyes, but the mention of Lionel Salt had turned her stiff and wooden. Balthazar was gone before she'd managed to react. Last call came soon after. Charlie wiped down the counter, filled a dishwasher with dirty shakers and glasses. She counted out her drawer, peeling the money for Doreen's drink off her tips and slipping it in with the rest of the bills. Rapture might exult in its strangeness, might have its walls and ceiling coated in black 3.0, paint so dark it stole light from a room, and might have air thick with incense. Might be the kind of place locals came to glimpse magic or kink, or if they got tired of sports bars with kombucha on tap. But the rituals of closing were the same. Most of the rest of the staff had already left by the time Charlie got her coat and purse out of Odette's office. The wind had kicked up, chilling the sweat on her body as she walked out to her car, reminding Charlie that it was already late autumn, barreling toward winter, and that she needed to start bringing something warmer to work than a thin leather coat. Well? Doreen asked. I'm freezing out here. Will you find him? Susie Lambden says you helped her out, and you barely even know her. The job probably wouldn't be too hard. And then she'd have Doreen off her back. If Adam was blissed out somewhere, she could always steal his wallet. That would send him back home fast. Take his car keys, too, just to show she could. Your brother works at the university, right? Office of the bursar? Doreen narrowed her eyes. He's a customer service representative. He answers phones. But he has access to the computers. So he can fix it so my sister has another month to pay her bill? Not asking him to cancel the debt, just delay it. Orientation fees, student technology fees, and processing fees were all due before the loan money showed up. That wasn't even counting the junker Posey would need to get back and forth to campus. Or books. I don't want to get him into trouble, Doreen said primly, as though she wasn't trying to persuade a criminal to find her criminal boyfriend. Charlie folded her arms across her chest and waited. Finally, Doreen nodded slowly. I guess I could ask. Which could mean a lot of things. Charlie opened the trunk of her janky Toyota Corolla. Her collection of burner phones rested beside a tangle of jumper cables, an old bag of burglary supplies, and a bottle of Grey Goose she'd bought wholesale off the bar. Charlie took out one of the phones and punched in the code to activate it. Okay, let me try something and see if Adam bites. Tell me his number. If he answered, she told herself, she'd do it. If he didn't, she'd walk away. She knew she was just looking for an excuse to get into trouble, wading into quicksand to see if she'd sink. She texted him anyway. I've got a job and I heard you were the best. If he was worried about not being good enough, then the flattery would be motivating. That was the nature of con artistry, playing on weakness. It was also a bad way to train your brain to think about people. Let's see if he responds, and Charlie started to say when her phone pinged. Who is this? Amber, Charlie texted back. She had several identities that she'd built for con and never used. Of them, Amber was the only glowmist. Sorry to bother you so late, but I really need your help. Amber with the long brown hair? Charlie stared at her phone for a long moment, trying to decide if this was a trick. You really are as good as they say. She added a winking emoji and hoped ambiguity would allow her to sidestep any of his questions. I can't believe he's texting you. What is he saying? Take a look, Charlie told Doreen, handing over the phone. See? He's alive. He's fine. Doreen bit her fingernail as she read through the messages. You didn't say you were going to flirt with him. Charlie rolled her eyes. On the other side of the parking lot, Odette, swathed in an enormous cocoon coat, made her way to her purple Mini Cooper. You really think you can get him to tell you where he's staying? Charlie nodded. Sure. I can even go there in hog time if that's what you want. You'll have to do me a better favor for that, though. Susie says asking you for help is like summoning up the devil. The devil might grant your wish, but afterward, you're out of soul. Charlie bit her lip, looked up at the streetlight. Like you said, I barely know Susie. She must be thinking of somebody else. Maybe, Doreen said. But all that stuff you did, even back in the day, the stuff people said, you've got to be angry at someone. Or I could have done it for fun, Charlie said. Which would be pretty messed up, right? And since I am doing you a good turn, it'd be polite not to mention it. Doreen gave one of those exhausted sighs that mothers of little kids seem to have welling up in them at all times. Right, sure. Just bring him home before he winds up like you. Charlie watched Doreen go, then got into her Corolla, buckled her seatbelt, tried not to think about the job Balthazar was offering, or who she used to be. Thought instead of the ramen she was going to boil when she got home. Hoped her sister had fed the cat. Imagined the mattress waiting for her on the floor of her bedroom. Imagined Vince, already asleep, feet tangled in the sheets. Shoved her key in the ignition. The car wouldn't turn on. 2. King of Cups, reversed. The wind whirled down the tunnel of Cottage Street, stinging Charlie's cheeks, sending hair into her face. Her Corolla still sat in the parking lot of Rapture, no matter how many times she twisted the key or slammed her hands against the dashboard. Jumper cables hadn't done a thing to resuscitate the car, and tow trucks were expensive. She'd considered calling Vince, or even a cab, but instead she'd gotten the vodka out of the trunk and done a couple of sulky shots straight out of the bottle, standing there feeling sorry for herself, looking up at the sky. The last of the leaves had turned brown. Only a few still hung on branches, drooping like sleeping bats. A car had slowed at the stop sign. The driver called out a vulgar proposal before he hit the gas. She flipped him off, although it seemed unlikely he noticed. It was nothing Charlie hadn't heard before anyway. She saw herself reflected in her car windows. Dark hair, dark eyes, a lot of everything else. Breast and butt and belly and thigh. Too often, people acted like her curves were some engraved invitation. They seemed to forget that everyone gets born into bodies they can't just kick off like slippers. Figures they can't transform as though they were shadows. Another gust of wind sent a few leaves into the air, although most clotted together along the edges of the road. And that was when Charlie had decided it would be a great idea to hoof it the 1.5 miles home. It was a nothing walk, after all. A stroll. Or it would have been, for someone who hadn't been on her feet all day and half the night. The term pot valiance occurred to her too late. She passed a darkened bookstore. In the window, a fall display of pumpkins with plastic vampire fangs jammed into their carved mouths. They rested toothily beside horror novels and a decorative dusting of candy corn, their orange bodies just beginning to sag with rot. The whole street was shuttered. Pulling her coat tighter, Charlie wished that East Hampton was like some of the surrounding college towns, Northampton or Amherst, full of enough tipsy students stumbling through the late-night streets to justify at least one pizza place staying open after the bars closed, or a coffee shop for up-all-night overachievers. All the quiet gave her too much time to think. Alone on the dark street, Charlie couldn't escape Doreen's words. But all that stuff you did, even back in the day, the stuff people said, you've got to be angry at someone. She kicked a loose chunk of cement. When she was a kid, Charlie had been a mop of black hair, brown eyes, and bad attitude. She'd gotten into one kind of trouble after another. But along the way, she learned she was good at taking things apart. Puzzles and people. She liked solving them, liked figuring out how to get at what they were hiding, to become what they wanted to believe in. Which made her consider the atom thing again. It couldn't hurt to play it through, distract herself from the night. Charlie fished out her phone and typed, "There's a volume in the Mortimer Rare book collection at Smith College that I'm sure contains something important. I can pay you, or we can work out a trade." Glomists were always on the hunt for old books detailing techniques for shadow manipulation. They'd been known to kill one another over them. She was offering Adam an easy job. It had to be somewhat tempting. For 10 years, she'd stolen things for one glomist or another. Books and scrolls, and occasionally other, worse things. For 10 years, she'd kept her identity secret. Kept a low profile, worked off and on in restaurants and bars to give her cover, and used Balthazar as her go-between. A little over a year ago, she'd put down a deposit on a house, convinced Posey to apply to colleges. Then, she'd blown it all up. It seemed like there'd been a furnace inside Charlie, always burning. A year ago, she'd seen how easily she could turn everything to ash. Adam wasn't writing back. Maybe he was asleep, or high, or just not interested. She shoved the burner back into her bag. Out of the corner of her eye, Charlie thought she saw the oily slide of something in the space between one building and the next. It took her mind off her past, but not in a good way. People talked about disembodied shadows walking the world the way they talked about Slender Man or the girl with the cheek full of spiders. But Charlie knew blights were more than a story. They were what was left over when the glomist died and the shadow didn't. Quite real and very dangerous. Onyx worked on them, and fire. But that was about it unless you were a glomist yourself. Her real phone chimed, drawing her thoughts back to the present with a start. It was a text from Vince. "All okay?" "Home soon," she texted back. She should have called him, back at Rapture. He would have picked her up. He probably would have been nice about it too. But she didn't like the idea of leaning on him. It would only make things worse when he was gone. A sound came from down the street, by where Noshawanik Pond ran into Rubber Thread Pond, across from the abandoned mill buildings. Someone was there. She walked faster, shoving her hand into her pocket to wrap around the handle of a folding tactical knife attached to her keys. It had kept an edge despite her using it to open cereal boxes and chip putty off old windows. She didn't have much of an idea how to use it to defend herself, but at least it was sharp and had an onyx handle to weaken shadows. A flicker of movement drew her gaze down an alley. A light-on outside one of the shop doors illuminated a heap of stained clothing, white bone, and a wall spattered with black spots of blood. Charlie stopped, muscles tensing, her stomach lurching, as her mind tried to catch up. Her brain kept supplying her with alternatives to what she saw. A discarded prop from a haunted house, a mannequin, an animal. But no, the remains were human. Raw flesh torn open, shredded along with clothing as though whoever did this was desperate to get to the person's insides. Charlie stepped closer. The cold contained the smell, but there was still a charnel sweetness to the air. The man's face was turned to one side, eyes glassy and open. His rib cage was broken and partially removed, jagged, pale bones rising above the mess of flesh like a circle of silver birch trees. And against the wall, there was the movement again. His shadow, which ought to have been as still as his corpse, was shredded and wafting in the breeze as though it was torn laundry on a line, as though a strong gust might blow it free. The man's face was so changed by death that it was the clothes she noticed first. Tweed, wrinkled and a little dirty, as though he'd been living rough in them. This was the man Balthazar had thrown out of Rapture's parlor, the guy who'd proposed selling something of salts back to him. 2 hours ago, she'd been setting of 4 roses in front of him. Now? There was a sound at the opposite end of the alley, and Charlie looked up with a sharp inhalation of breath. A man in a long, dark coat and hat, with eyes as dark as bullet holes, was staring at her. There was something wrong with his hands. Really wrong. They were entirely made of shadow, right to the scarred nubs of his wrists. He began to walk toward Charlie, his footsteps sharp and distinct on the asphalt. Half her instincts were telling her to run, the other half wanting her to freeze because running would ignite the predator's desire to give chase. Was she really going to fight? The knife in her hand seemed ridiculously small, little better than cuticle scissors. Sirens wailed in the distance. At the sound, the man paused. They watched one another, the corpse between them. Then he stepped back, slipping around the corner and out of her line of sight. Charlie felt lightheaded with shock and horrifyingly sober. Forcing herself to move, she stumbled out of the alley and fast-walked toward Union. If she was near the body when the police arrived, they were going to have a lot of questions, and weren't likely to believe a story about some guy with shadow hands. Especially not from Charlie, who had been hauled in twice before the age of 18 for confidence schemes. Her legs were carrying her forward, but her mind was reeling. Ever since the Boxford massacre 20 years ago, when the world had become aware of gloamists, Western Massachusetts had been lousy with them. The Silicon Valley of shadow magic. From Springfield, with its shuttered gun factories and boarded-up mansions, to the universities and colleges, to the idiosyncratic farms of the hill towns, polluted rivers, and the marshy beauty of the Quabbin Reservoir. The valley was cheap enough and close enough to both New York and Boston to be a draw. Plus, it had an already high tolerance for weirdos. There were goats available for mowing lawns, a gun club that ran an annual Renaissance fair. You could buy an 18th century bed frame and a hand-thrown pot in the shape of a vagina and score heroin from a guy at a bus station, all within a 15-minute travel window. These days, you can add on stumbling into a shadow parlor and getting an alterationist to remove your desire for any of the aforementioned vices, or adding on a new one. Rolling bliss was skyrocketing in popularity. The more gloamists there were, the more the towns were changing, and there wasn't enough onyx in the world to stop it. And yet, for all that, this murder seemed uniquely awful. Whoever, or whatever, had done it would have needed incredible strength to crack open a body like a walnut. She shoved her trembling hands deep into her pockets. Her familiar route had become strange to her, full of jagged shadows that moved with each gust of wind. Her nose seemed to catch the scent of spoiling meat. 2 more breathless blocks, and then she was heading up her driveway, hands trembling. The bell over the door jangled as she entered into the ugly yellow kitchen of their rental house. A frying pan and 2 dirty dishes sat in the sink. There was a plate domed with another near the microwave. Their cat, Lucifer, nosed it hopefully. Heading toward the living room, she found Vince asleep in front of a television turned down low. His big body sprawled on their scavenged couch, a paperback resting on his stomach. When she looked at him, she felt a stab of longing, the uncomfortable sensation of missing someone who hadn't yet gone. Her gaze went to where his shadow ought to have fallen, but there was nothing at all. When Charlie had first met him, her eye had noted something off, as though he was always a little out of focus, a little blurred at the edges. Maybe she'd been distracted by being drunk, or by his being hard-jawed and clean-cut in a way guys attracted to her never were. It wasn't until she saw him the next morning, silhouetted in a doorway, seeming as though light was streaming through him, that she realized he didn't have a shadow. Posey had noticed right away. Now Charlie's sister sat on the worn gray shag rug, squinting at a grainy moving image on her laptop, a spread of cards in front of her. She had on the same pajamas that she'd been in when Charlie left, the cuffs scuffed and dirty. No bra. Her light brown hair twisted into a messy bun on top of her head. The only adornment she wore was an onyx and gold septum ring, which she never removed. Posey took all her Zoom calls with the camera on her end off, at least partially so she didn't have to dress up for them. She sounded entirely professional, her voice soothing as she continued her tarot reading, barely seeming to notice Charlie. 9 of Wands, reversed. You're exhausted. You want to give a lot of yourself, but lately you feel as though there's nothing left to give. The person on the other end must have started spilling their guts, because Posey cut herself off and just listened. When they were kids, their mother had dragged them to lots of psychics. Charlie remembered staring at dusty velvet pillows and beaded curtains in the front room of a house off the highway, Posey's head on her lap, listening to their mom getting lied to about her future. But even if it was a scam, their mother had needed someone to talk with, and it wasn't like she was going to open up to anyone else. Psychics were therapists for people who couldn't admit they needed therapy. They were magic for people who desperately needed a little magic, back before magic was real. And while Charlie didn't believe Posey had powers, she did think that her clients got someone who treated their problems as important, who wanted to help. That seemed worth a $50 donation and a subscription to our Patreon. Charlie went back out to the kitchen and uncovered the plate. Vince had cooked egg tacos, with sliced avocado on the side and twin splashes of Tabasco and sriracha. From the plates in the sink, it looked like he'd even made some for Posey. Charlie ate hers at the rusty folding table in the kitchen, while she listened to her sister talk. King of Cups, also reversed. You're a smart woman, but sometimes you make decisions you know aren't the best. A shiver of leftover adrenaline made her put her fork down for a moment and take a few ragged breaths. She tried to focus on her sister's voice, on the familiarity of the story Posey was telling. The majority of people who called for readings had problems to do with love. Maybe they wanted to know if they had a chance with somebody in particular. Or maybe they were lonely, and wanted someone to tell them it wasn't their fault they hadn't found the right person. But most often it was because they were in a relationship that had gone bad, and part of them wanted to be told that it would be worth all the suffering, while another part of them wanted permission to get out. Most of their mother's visits to psychics had been about relationships. The Hall women fell in love like they were falling off a cliff. They were terrible at picking men, as though there was some kind of ancestral curse that started with Nana's marriage to a guy so awful that she was still in prison for shooting him in the back of the head while he was in his Barcalounger, watching TV. It lasted through Mom making Charlie and Posey sit quietly in the backseat of a Kia while she drove around trying to catch their father cheating. Through a stepdad who broke Posey's wrist and an ex-boyfriend of Charlie's so desperate for money to pay a gambling debt that he convinced her to file tax returns for dead people and give him the cash from the refunds. Posey said that a guy had to have a hole in his head, his heart, or his pocket for one of the Hall women to go head over heels for him. Maybe that was true. Maybe there needed to be something missing in a man, so that Charlie felt she could pour herself into that absence and heal him like an elixir. Or maybe it was only that Charlie felt as though she'd lost something too. And loss sings to loss. Vince was a dependable guy. Tough, hardworking. The halting quality to the way he told stories about his family made it clear he was uncomfortable sharing much about his past. But she'd been sizing up marks for long enough to make some good guesses. The calluses on his hands were new. And he had the kind of straight teeth that were the result of braces. Knew the kind of stuff you learned in college but didn't have any debt. He'd come from money. Charlie wondered if they'd turn their backs on him after he lost his shadow. She tried to ask, but his answers were evasive. And she hadn't tried hard, because she wasn't sure she wanted to hear about that better life, and how far he'd fallen from it. After all, he was willing to look the other way when the real Charlie Hall emerged. The one attracted to trouble, prone to bleak jags where she barely got out of bed. The one who'd spent years trying to blot out the Ouroboros of her thoughts with too much alcohol, too many men, and a string of heists. People said that a person without a shadow didn't experience emotion as fully or deeply as other people. Maybe that's why it didn't bother Vince. What she was and what she'd done. At home with Vince, she tried to be both fabulous and fabulist's creation. A woman whose past as a con artist was long over, and who wasn't fighting down the urge to go off the rails again. And if he was slightly too good a listener, if she sometimes suspected that he could hear the hurt, feral part of her yearning to lash out, at least he didn't push her away. "Come on," Charlie said, poking Vince's leg with her foot. She wanted him to come to bed with her. Needed his breath in her hair and the weight of his arm across her to protect her from thinking about white bone or drying gore or men with shadows for hands. Vince opened his eyes, stretched, turned off the television. He had that tall man's habit of hunching a little when he stood, like he was trying to be less intimidating. "Did you find the food?" he asked, passing her on the way to the bedroom, his fingertips sliding across her back. She shivered greedily, inhaling the perfume of bleach that still clung to his skin from work. "You're a good guy," she told him. He smiled in answer, confused, but pleased. Vince paid his bills. He took out the trash. He was kind to the cat, and if he longed for another life, he was with Charlie now. It didn't matter what was in his heart any more than it mattered what was in hers. 3. The past. When Charlie was 13, she told her mother she'd had a visitation. Mom had gotten deeply into crystals and divination after her divorce and had a friend who got messages from angels, so it wasn't like the idea came from nowhere. Charlie claimed that the spirit of a witch who had died during the Inquisition had started speaking to her, and then through her. It wasn't a good plan, in retrospect. But Mom wouldn't listen to her any other way, and Charlie was desperate. Enter Elvira de Granada, a character half based on an anime seen late at night, and half on bullshit from grocery store horror novels. But Elvira could say all the things that Charlie Hall couldn't. Elvira could spit out all the pent-up rage that filled an already scarred heart. The problem was that Mom really, really, really needed to be convinced that her new husband was a bad guy, and fast. Travis was mean and hated Charlie and Posey. But he wasn't stupid. When he smacked Posey, for nothing, for just jumping around and annoying him and refusing to go to bed on time, he did it when Mom wasn't there to see. And instead of acting like nothing happened, he claimed Charlie hit her sister and that Posey was covering. Charlie got punished, of course, and so did Posey for lying. From then on, Travis knew he had the upper hand. He told their mother that she needed to set more boundaries with the kids, that their dad had let them get away with bloody murder, that they were sneaky, lied for attention, and stole from his wallet. And if Mom didn't do something soon, they would never respect her. Plus, they'd probably wind up in prison. When he hit Charlie, she didn't even try to tell. Mom was fascinated by the idea that her daughter might be a medium. She was astonished when Charlie told her facts about relatives, although they were just things she'd remembered or stories she'd overheard. Occasionally, they were straight-up lies about dead people that seemed impossible to disprove. But even Elvira de Granada couldn't convince Charlie's mother that Travis was no good. Charlie's mother decided that Elvira was bitter and distrustful on account of being tortured to death. And that's when Charlie came up with Alonso Nieto, warlock. Unlike Elvira, he wasn't just accused of witchcraft. He admitted to being a practitioner. It turns out that men have more authority, even when they're not real. Mom loved talking to Alonso. Charlie had thought she'd been convincing when playing Elvira, but with Alonso, Mom wanted to be convinced. Charlie knew she had to be careful all the same. If Alonso was going to successfully persuade Mom to leave Travis, the warlock needed to give them something concrete. It didn't hurt that Travis's badness was starting to leak out. When they were first married, he made a big show of telling Mom how perfect she was and how great their life was going to be. But he couldn't keep it up. Now, when they argued, he'd start in with comments about her weight and about how she wasn't that smart. Flowers and date nights faded away, and so did a big chunk of his contribution to their finances. Charlie knew she had an opportunity, but she needed help. So she let her little sister in on the plan. Posey had been confused by Elvira and Alonso, although happy someone was talking shit about the stepdad she hated. Still, it had clearly creeped her out to see her sister possessed. Now that she knew it was a game, though, everything was different. Professional psychics usually specialize in one of two types of readings, although neither sister knew that at the time. The first kind was a cold reading, the kind that Posey would go on to do as a phone psychic, making up things on the spot based on observations. The second kind of reading was hot. During a cold reading, the psychic might study how often a client looked at their phone, whether their finger had a pale patch of skin from the removal of a wedding ring, the newness of their shoes, or the visibility of their tattoos. On the phone, the psychic had to rely on their word choices, their accent, and the level of agitation in their voice. A good cold reading was the convincer that allowed the client to relax and start supplying information. A hot reading was something else. It involved doing research on a person ahead of time. Some celebrity psychics even bugged their intermission halls or sent out assistants to eavesdrop on audience members at performances. That's what Charlie intended to do, a hot reading. With Posey's help, they went through Travis's pockets. They figured out the password on his computer and scrolled through his browser history, his emails, his Facebook messages. They located his stash of porn, which was gross, but contained nothing weird enough to sink him. It turned out that he wasn't flirting with anyone else or embezzling money. Travis was evil, and also boring. Though Charlie didn't do great in school and had been long ago sorted into the group of kids who were never going to college, she read a lot and she paid attention. She was smart, but smart kids can still be plenty stupid. Charlie decided that since she couldn't find anything on Travis, she'd create evidence. She made a new Facebook page with his name and picture, then started flirting with women. Soon that became texting on a burner phone. Managing being Travis part of the time and Alonzo the rest of the time was exhausting. It was playing pretend on steroids. But rather than getting tired of it, she found herself frustrated by all the time she had to spend as Charlie Hall, who was still a kid with a lot of math homework. She looked forward to improvisation, when it seemed like all the right words came out of a part of her that she didn't even know was there. Even though she was able to fake up evidence, she wasn't sure it would be enough to convince her mother. She enlisted Posey to manipulate their environment, to flash lights in rooms on the other side of the apartment, turn on the stove, and leave little things where their mother could find them, to show off Alonzo's power. They reinvented the Victorian spiritualism movement from first principles. Charlie had stumbled into one of the headiest delusions that existed. Alonzo told Mom that she was important, special, chosen. He was vague on the details, but the details didn't matter. It wasn't long before Mom was on the hook. In fact, sometimes it seemed to Charlie that her mother was more interested in Alonzo than in her, more excited to spend time with him than with her kid. Sometimes Charlie felt like the most important thing about her was being a vessel. After a bad night where Travis yelled at Charlie to clean up her room, and when she didn't do it to his satisfaction, ripped her copy of Howl's Moving Castle in half, she decided it was time. 3 days later, Alonzo told Mom to look in the glove compartment of Travis's car, where Posey had already planted the burner phone. After that, things started moving very fast. Mom looked through the messages on the phone and saw the promises Travis had made to these women and the awful stuff he told them about her. Travis denied it all, becoming more and more furious when he wasn't believed. Sucks to be you, Charlie thought with satisfaction, remembering how many times her mother had believed him instead of them. Charlie was glad when they moved out, gladder still when her mother filed for divorce, thrilled to be moving into their small new apartment, even if money was tighter than ever. But Charlie was a little afraid of what she had done. It was a heavy weight to know that she had committed a betrayal so big that if her mother found out, Charlie might never be forgiven. And she was in no way ready for her mother to introduce Alonzo to her friends. Charlie refused to go. She cried and insisted that she didn't want to, that she didn't like letting him talk through her anymore. She was teetering on the cusp of adulthood, 3/4 child, 1/4 yearning. Her dreams were confused kaleidoscopes of swanning through the sets of TV shows, drinking cocktails that looked like vodka martinis and tasted like Sprite, wearing lipstick and pumps covered in red craft glitter, and marrying someone who was half pop star and half stuffed animal. She knew she had to stop pretending to be Alonzo before she got caught, but she didn't know how to stop without disappointing her mother. Just let him come through. This will be the last time, I promise, honey. Her mother convinced her to talk to the friends once, and then a second time. By the third visit, Charlie could tell that some of them had grown skeptical. Rand, a portly man with a beautifully waxed mustache, tried to trip her up with historical questions, and Charlie panicked. She talked too much. On the car ride back, she could feel her mother's gaze on her, disheartened and on the verge of disillusionment. Charlie's whole body felt as heavy as lead. The third time, she didn't protest going, although her mother seemed conflicted. Still, Charlie had looked up historical facts, and between those and Alonzo's probable ignorance about things like antibiotics and gravity, she thought she could push through one more time. More important, Charlie had remembered what worked on her mother. Charlie didn't need to convince them of anything. She needed to make them want to believe. And so instead of answering their questions, she spun a jagged-edged fantasy. She knew all her mother's friends well enough to guess who hoped her sculptures would be featured in a magazine, who wanted love, who wanted her children to move closer. Alonzo told them what they wanted to hear, with a kick in the ass. You have already met the man you are destined to be with, and you know who he is and why you're not together. Your children will be at their happiest near a lake, but they will resist this knowledge. Your work will be celebrated after your death. And then Alonzo told them he had fulfilled his purpose and that he would finally be allowed to move on. After solemn and tearful goodbyes, Charlie let her whole body go limp. She fell to the floor and pretended unconsciousness for a full minute, until she worried they were going to call an ambulance. Even her mother's most skeptical friend plied her with cookies and herbal tea after that. She never had another visitation. Sometimes her mom looked at her strangely, but Charlie tried not to notice. And Posey, jealous of the attention Charlie had gotten, started reading tarot cards and cultivating a 1,000-yard stare. While Charlie felt as though she had been left with only the least interesting parts of herself and lost the rest.